Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. This show is brought to you by my company, Motion. We are a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. In this episode, I want to tackle one of the most important components of a successful branded podcast, and that's distribution. It's important for two reasons. Number one, distribution is probably the area where I get the most questions. And number two, from my perspective, it's often not prioritized enough by marketing teams. Look, I wish listeners would organically find your company's podcast episodes on Apple, and I wish they'd immediately become raving fans of your brand. But that's not going to happen. There's a lot of content out there, and people are consuming more media now than ever. So how does a scrappy marketer get the most from their company's podcast? Well, if you want to grow your podcast audience and actually help your customers, you need a repeatable podcast distribution plan that's easy to manage. You need to break through the noise by being consistent with a strategy designed to reach every listener, reader, and viewer. Because after all, your company's podcast is more than just an audio recording. Based on the shows we produce at Motion and the 50 shows we produce for other tech companies, I view distribution as a combination of really three different phases. The three key phases include, number one, repurpose and breakdown. This is a phase that involves the development of a variety of assets to share across different distribution channels. This is where your team focuses on the development of audio, video, and written content. The second phase is distribute. In this phase, you focus on primary distribution channels, such as your company's social profiles, your company's website, and podcast platforms like Apple, Google, and other ones. And the third phase is enrich. During this phase, your team enhances other marketing content that you have out there with assets created from your podcast episode. So let's think a bit deeper about that first phase. Let's go back to repurpose and breakdown. For every podcast episode, it helps to have a consistent process in place for repurposing. During the editing process, we actually have an entire list of assets we develop from a single video recording. Here's what we create from every episode of recorded content. We have a full-length audio and video episode. This is considered the pillar content. We have detailed show notes, short promotional videos or podcast trailers, custom thumbnails and episode art, social images, clean transcripts, and more. So why are all these different formats needed? Well, here's the truth. Not everyone wants to listen to audio content. And some people don't want to commit to a 45-minute video podcast from the jump either. Therefore, it's up to you as a marketer to reach your audience where they hang out, even if that's not in the Apple Podcasts app. When you create a show for your company, you're looking to reach people in your target audience, even if they don't consume podcasts. I like to think about a podcast as really this pillar piece of content that can be consumed in a variety of ways, in whatever format a person prefers. After you have your podcast episode broken down into different formats, it's now time to distribute your podcast across your primary channels. This is what I like to call table stakes for your company's show. Here are the steps that we take with our own shows we produce at Motion. We publish LinkedIn posts from the company page, publish a series of tweets or threads on Twitter from the company account. We publish a dedicated episode page on our website, and this includes detailed show notes formatted for the design of each show. We upload the full-length audio on a podcast hosting platform and then distribute to all of the major podcast directories like Apple, Google, Stitcher, etc. And then we also upload the full-length version as a YouTube podcast. With primary distribution, you take the opportunity to share the information contained within your podcast episode in audio, written, and video formats. This takes care of all the different types of formats needed to reach your audience across a lot of different channels. In the final stage of your podcast distribution plan, you focus on enriching the content you have available already. This is where we really start to get all of the value from each episode or each conversation that you have. With enrichment, your company gets an opportunity to use content derived from the podcast episode in a lot of other places. For example, there's a lot you can do with podcast content through your own company newsletter and blog. And you can also begin implementing an employee advocacy program where your podcast gets distributed through all of the different individual social profiles of your employees. In this enrichment phase, this is what we do at Motion. We embed podcast videos and trailers within blog posts. We attach videos and social images to personal social posts on LinkedIn, create tweets and longer threads using quotes from a podcast episode. We share images and videos on Twitter. We share information in emails to prospects and customers. And then we share in Slack channels or Facebook groups as well. Another area where we use podcast assets is within our paid ad strategy. I rarely see companies advertising their podcasts through paid ads, even though organizations can target their audience on LinkedIn and other platforms specifically. If you plan out your podcast episodes properly and actually focus on helping your customers, podcasts can drive much of the content needed for a paid advertising strategy. Paid ads can work to grow your podcast subscribers, but they can also be used at various stages throughout the customer journey to drive more awareness around the problem your company solves. You can use posts and concepts that performed well organically as the basis of a strong paid ad. Ultimately, when you use these three phases together, you start to get a flywheel going, and your podcast starts to help your customers across their entire customer journey. So if you have a podcast already, or if you're thinking about starting one for your company, focus on these three phases. Number 1, repurpose and break down. Number 2, distribute. And number 3, enrich. If you can get consistent across these three phases, they're going to be steps ahead of your competitors, and you're going to have a great system for helping your customers. That's all I have for today. Thanks for joining me on Recorded Content, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.